Hello, we're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan,
This is WaffleByte, where we bring you interesting bites about technology, business,
and things that might change the world.
You can find links to our articles in the description,
and you can skip to the chapters you're most interested in.
But for now, enjoy the show. This episode, we'll be discussing
the war against social media, Google's antitrust woes, and Intel's business struggles.
We'll also be taking a look at Graffiti, trying to unpack some of the mysteries behind it and the radical changes it has recently experienced.
Our thought for the episode is, should more people switch to an e-ink or dumb phone?
And with that, let's get straight into it.
The social media company X was banned in Brazil on the 31st of August. Brazil's telecommunications provider were given 24 hours to comply to the ban. Starlink, under the parent company SpaceX, which is mostly owned by Elon Musk, refused to comply initially, however later complied after their bank accounts were frozen.
I imagine Starlink is really popular in Brazil because there's quite a low population density over there, and therefore there's probably inadequate internet services for rural farming communities or people in the Amazon rainforest.
X was banned because they failed to appoint a legal representative in the country, and this was because Elon Musk removed the prior legal representative because of threats to her arrest after Elon Musk failed to comply with some takedown requests. A fine of £6,800 was imposed on anybody attempting to use X via VPN.
I think this is absolutely crazy because we're talking about Brazil here, where £6,800 is roughly the same as the GDP per capita of Brazil. And so a lot of people who might be using a VPN to access X can simply not afford to pay this fine. And I think this fine is just way, way too harsh, and it should at least be a few £100s at most.
I also imagine it would be pretty hard to enforce, or at least they would need lots of resources to enforce such a ban like this. Brazil, prior to banning X, had more than 20 million users on X, and Blue Sky, which is effectively an X clone, gained over 2 million users. Now, the reason why there was this dispute between the Supreme Court judge and Elon Musk was because Elon Musk refused to ban some accounts that Brazilian officials deemed to be misinformation, and Elon Musk labelled it as censorship instead. It should be noted, however, that Elon Musk has patchy records in terms of freedom of speech, as he often cooperates with takedown requests by government, just not in this case. Now, Sourish, do you think Elon Musk is having an outsized influence on X, and thereby creating this inconsistency where he'll sometimes comply with government takedown requests, but sometimes he'll essentially just ignore them like he did in this case?
Exactly. It makes no sense to me as to why Elon Musk is, for some reason, giving special treatment to Brazil. And I wonder if there's some sort of underlying reason that he's doing this for.
I do think it's possible that Elon Musk might favour certain governments over others, and I think he might just particularly dislike the Brazilian administration because of their political views, and therefore it is possible that Elon Musk has different standards based on different governments, and he'll comply with takedown requests from more friendly governments, whereas those that he deems to be more hostile, he'll just ignore, like in this case, in the most spectacular fashion.
And so all of a sudden, Elon Musk has therefore kind of made himself one of the most powerful people in the world by controlling the social media platform and making executive decisions entirely by himself on a whim. And this is not good.
Yeah, I do think we need more consistency in terms of freedom of speech, whilst also cooperating with governments and their legal requirements in different jurisdictions. But hopefully Elon Musk does respect freedom of speech and doesn't just take down things he doesn't like or refuse to take down harmful things because of his own opinions. I think we need a standard that is always adhered to and is consistent around the world as much as possible.
I think the positives that X brings to Brazil are probably greater than the negatives of having to deal with government censorship on the platform. And therefore, even if Elon Musk doesn't believe in Brazil government censorship, maybe freedom of speech is still benefited by having X available in Brazil. And therefore, maybe if he really did care about freedom of speech, he would just allow the government to censor the odd thing on X.
Moving on, our next topic is about Telegram. Telegram is a social network that offers encrypted direct messages as well as large groups of up to 200,000 users. So if you haven't heard, the CEO of Telegram, the Russian-born French citizen Pavel Durov, was arrested on the 25th of August by French authorities. He was charged for allegedly allowing criminal activity on Telegram, but paid a €5 million bail to avoid being jailed for now. Telegram is known for its relaxed moderation policy and is allegedly used by terrorist organizations, drug traffickers, arms dealers, and other groups conducting illegal activity.
I feel like a lot of platforms are used by a lot of people for a lot of illegal activities. So why is Telegram the only one that is being attacked in this case? Why not X? Why not Facebook? Why not any of these other platforms that also facilitate lots of illegal activities to go on? I also don't think it's fair to put the pressure on the company that provides the app, because they're just providing a tool. It's like if someone makes a gun, like in America, for example, if it's not illegal to make a gun, it's illegal to use the gun to kill someone. And why is that rule not applied to software as well?
I suspect there's an outsized share of illegal activity on Telegram personally, but I absolutely agree with your argument about the use versus the creation of the tool, because if you have a hammer, for example, you could easily kill somebody with a hammer, but if you're just using it to nail some nails, that's perfectly fine. So these tools that are created, both in hardware and software, can be used for illegal activity, but just because it can doesn't mean the creator of the tool should be penalized just because some people are using the tool that they created for illegal activities. What's interesting is that Telegram only has 30 full-time engineers. Now that seems like not very much, but I think given the fact that Telegram doesn't offer that many features and isn't really very sophisticated in terms of its functionality, I think that's pretty reasonable. Sourish, would you agree?
Yeah, I think they don't constantly push out new features, and they're not working or partnering up with other companies or ad businesses and things like that. So I think it makes sense.
I think it's interesting to look at Pavel Durov himself and his relationship with both France and Russia. He was born in what was then the Soviet Union, but quickly became Russia, and he started a social media company called VK, which was essentially a Facebook clone in Russia in 2006. And this was used by lots of Russians. It became very quickly very popular, but it also was used by certain opposition groups to the administration. In 2013, he sold his shares in the social media company VK to Kremlin-friendly investors after there were tensions because he refused to censor some of the political opposition to the administration. He then started Telegram soon after exiting Russia, and it quickly gained popularity by a variety of different users, including some potentially doing illegal activities and some political opposition. It was interesting to see that Russia had tried to block Telegram in 2018, but failed and eventually lifted the block in 2020. Pavel Durov has frequently visited Russia since 2014, and his ties with the Kremlins are unclear. He was also, however, in 2021, granted French citizenship, and President Emmanuel Macron had tried to get him to relocate Telegram to France as part of his push for more tech investment in the country. Earlier this week, however, he broke silence by complaining the fact that he was not contacted prior to his arrest, and he could have assisted French authorities if they had any issues with how Telegram was conducting itself in France. So, we've already touched on if Telegram is in the wrong. I think it would be fair to say we both think that they are themselves not in the wrong. But it's worth noting because there's been an increased push within the EU, but also abroad, for example, in the US, where lawmakers are trying to suggest that the CEO of big tech companies should be held responsible if illegal activity, such as child sexual images or sexual abuse, are on their platforms, that the CEOs should be held responsible. Now, personally, I don't think that should be the case, but Suresh, what do you make of this increasing push by lawmakers to hold these executives more accountable for bad moderation on their social media platforms?
It's a really tough one because you would expect big companies like Meta or Google to invest some resources into at least trying to moderate their platforms. But the reason this particular scenario I think is different is because Telegram is a tiny company with pretty much no revenue. And so can you really expect them to try and invest lots of time and hire another 30 people to perhaps moderate all of their chats? I think you can't. And so how do you determine whether a company should moderate their platform? Because you can't really determine that by users because Telegram has a ton of users. Maybe you can determine that by revenue. But what if, for example, the profit margins of a company are really slim? It's just, how do you define whether a company should be responsible for this?
Personally, I think that if we have some laws put in place, as we do in the EU, that companies should be expected to comply with these laws. And even though maybe a small company with limited profit margins, as you said, might face difficulty, I do think that there should be certain laws regulating the behavior on these platforms. However, I don't think that CEOs should be held responsible. I think instead you should penalize the company if they've done something wrong, and if these penalties are significant enough, the CEOs will themselves have to take responsibility, because otherwise their company will, either their share price will drop or they'll be fined so much that their profits are not big enough. And that will cause problems for the CEO themselves, because hopefully their incentives are linked to company performance. So I don't think it's right to penalize the CEO themselves, but I do think that certainly in the case of Meta, for example, that there should be certain restrictions put in place to make sure that as much as is deemed reasonable, they comply with regulations related to child safety, for example.
The CEO is the public image of a company. And we see that especially in America with big tech. When Meta is beginning to do well this year, all of a sudden Zuck decided to go full into that and change his appearance and kind of get himself all over the news cycles. And with this publicity comes both the good things that Zuck is facing right now, but also the bad things when all of these CEOs are sent to court or even jailed in this case. And I think you kind of have to expect both sides of the coin to happen to you if you're the CEO of a huge company. But, of course, Telegram is not a huge company.
Before Elon Musk, all the CEOs kind of kept a low profile and were active amongst Wall Street, were active among their friends who are perhaps other executives at tech companies. But ever since Elon Musk had such a great presence on Twitter, which he later bought and renamed to X, more and more CEOs have come out and given interviews or had a public persona that they deem to be advantageous for their job as a CEO. I think it's an interesting shift, but also, in the case of Elon Musk, for example, I think public perception of him has declined since the early days of him being on Twitter and tweeting very frequently.
Absolutely.
Our third story of the day concerns Intel. Bloomberg exclusively reported that Intel is discussing with Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, its investment banks, about possible strategies to turn around the company. Intel has struggled tremendously this year. Their stock price has declined 60% this year, compared to an industry average of a 20% gain, and Nvidia has gained over 100%.
Yeah, actually, it was closer to 140% a few months ago. But then $400 billion was wiped off Nvidia's market cap after their earnings beat expectations, but they didn't beat expectations by a huge amount, which is kind of weird. But anyway.
Yes, that's crazy. 400 billion is a lot, and it was essentially just wiped out in a week. Back to Intel though, recently their enthusiast CPUs, which are targeted at gamers, have also been plagued with reliability issues, with aggressive voltages accelerating the failure of some CPUs.
Speaking of voltages and CPU failures, I tried to undervolt my brand new Ryzen CPU, and I'm slightly annoyed that I couldn't achieve the maximum undervolt whilst maintaining stability. Anyway.
I think these days, all CPUs are shipped with very aggressive voltage curves out of the factory, so undervolting maybe isn't as lucrative as it maybe was previously. But Intel has also struggled to gain AI market share and is struggling to compete with AMD, Qualcomm and Apple in the mobile chips business. So some options they explored were splitting off its foundry business to go fabless. Its fab lost $7 billion in 2023 and is still behind TSMC in terms of efficiency and manufacturing nodes. Personally, however, I think this is a bad idea because they need to be able to compete with TSMC eventually, especially because there's increased geopolitical tensions and TSMC is taking their time to build factories in the United States. So if Intel can get their act together and have a competitive fab, then they could potentially take business away from TSMC, from companies who want to hedge their bets and have multiple sourcing options.
I don't really see the point in splitting off the fab business from the rest of Intel, because the culture in both of those businesses is still going to remain the same. Like, what are you going to do when you split off the fab? You've still got two not so great companies that aren't doing so well right now. And I think instead of trying to focus on like shifting the company structure. They should kind of focus on getting better products and improving the company culture instead. And if they do that, that's how they become competitive, not by splitting off their business into two parts.
It should be noted, however, that AMD had very good success in doing just that, splitting off its fab into global foundries under the CEO Lisa Su. This was done because their fab, now global foundries, was struggling to keep up with the leading nodes, but they could still make money manufacturing for companies which didn't require the leading node, for example, 14 nanometer, 28 nanometer. Now, the problem with that is you essentially make less money because all the money is with TSMC and their leading fabs. So if you decide to only focus on lesser fabs, then you're limiting the amount of money you can make. I also think, as you said, their problems isn't necessarily with the fabs, it's with the company as a whole. And Pat Gausinger, who replaced Bob Swan, is now under pressure to deliver because people are starting to have doubts in his vision, and he's struggling to have the same authority that he used to have. Another option that Intel are considering is IPOing of their specialist chip-making division Altera, which they acquired for $16.7 billion in 2015. And this seems to me like a desperate move to get some more cash so that they can invest in their fab technologies and their other parts of their businesses which have a greater potential in the future.
The whole tech landscape is just really volatile, and within 1 or 2 years, a company can completely skyrocket to become the dominator. And so I think all is not yet lost for Intel, but they have been on a downward trajectory for quite a while. So management just needs to get their act together and leverage all of the talent and the experience and the connections that they do have to output competitive products.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, just in 2021, which was just a couple of years ago, Intel had 3 times the revenue as Nvidia. And as we all know, Nvidia has skyrocketed to the giant that it is today. And Intel has almost halved its market capitalization just this year. So it really shows how volatile the tech industry can be and how it's really, really difficult to be ahead of the game all the time. Our next topic is about Google, specifically Google's issues with antitrust authorities around the world, it seems. The UK CMA, which is Competition and Markets Authority, has been investigating Google's abuse of its dominant position in the ad tech space since 2022, which it alleged favours its own products. So Google dominates the whole stack of ad tech businesses, including ad buying, Google Ads, ad publishing, DoubleClick for publishers, and ad exchange, which is ADX for short. Now, ADX charges up to 20%, so it's a very significant fee.
And for those of you who don't know what an ad exchange is, it's essentially a marketplace where buyers or people can buy ad spots or ad placements and sell them as well. So it's this place where companies can kind of merge together and do deals about ads.
For example, the CMA has accused Google of allegedly unfairly advantaging its own services by giving people who buy ads through ADX exclusive access to those websites who use Google Ads to display ads.
I don't know what Google's official defense statement would be for something like this, but I think they can make a very valid claim, which is that if they build all of these products and services, then integrating them together isn't necessarily something that they should be charged for.
Yeah, I think they need to make sure to blur the line between what they're doing by building up a very good and very lucrative ad business compared to unfairly disadvantaging other services, because as you said, they can make a compelling argument that they're just making their business as good as it can be.
Yes, I think the issue lies in the exclusivity part of this.
Meanwhile, in the United States, the Department of Justice has noted that Google will be punished by next August for their antitrust infringements related to Google search.
Now, I don't know what the Department of Justice think a punishment is for someone like Google, but if it's just going to be like another $500 million fine, that's fine. Like, Google avoids billions in tax every single year anyway. What's $500 million going to do to them? So I think the Department of Justice really needs to just do something to actually harm Google or get Google to stop being so anti-competitive.
It should be noted, however, that the DOJ has considered spinning off Google's search and or AdWords business. Continuing on with the US antitrust crackdown, wealthy donors from both the Democrats and the Republicans have expressed their distaste towards Lina Khan, which is the FTC chairman. Lina Khan has notably started cracking down on big tech in particular, and clearly this has angered lots of these rich donors. I think this is exactly what you would expect, given that these donors are very rich and they have business connections that mean that they would profit from monopolies. And it's a very classic case of political lobbying. But I think that it would be best if both candidates did not succumb to this pressure and kept Lina Khan, because I think she's doing very important work and very overdue work, more importantly.
Lobbying is a difficult thing because in some cases it can support the general public opinion. For example, when Louis Rosman did a ton of lobbying in the past few years, he did get a few pretty significant rights to repair bills passed in America. But equally, if lobbying is just used by huge corporations like Google, then that's where lobbying falls down and fails. But you can't really create rules that determines lobbying is okay in this case and not okay in this case. So it's kind of an all or nothing approach, which is a bit unfortunate.
I think the issue with lobbying is that it often favours the rich and powerful. This means that the rich and powerful get what they want, often at the expense of the general public. In addition, when the general public wants to advance something that would benefit them, they can often struggle because these rich and powerful donors have so much money that they can just out-lobby somebody representing the general public. Next up, would you give Amazon your biometric data? Amazon One is now allowing you to pay with your palm. This is done by you uploading pictures of your palm and it generates a palm signature. Amazon then claims it deletes its photos of your palm, and you can use this signature at stores which support the technology to pay with your palm.
When you say stores, are you referring to those Amazon Fresh stores?
No, I'm referring to, I think the example that gave in the Wall Street Journal article was a Whole Foods, which is a upmarket supermarket chain, mainly in the US, but I think they have a store or two in London as well. But I think it's being rolled out, so it might come to more stores, not just Amazon Fresh stores, of course.
Good.
Sourish, would you use such a palm payment platform?
I don't know about that because it's definitely going to be a lot more convenient. But equally, is it really that inconvenient to whip out a credit card and tap it on a terminal? And I think it isn't. And therefore, I think I probably won't use this technology just because, yes, it's convenient, but it's like 5% better than our current solution. It's not worth giving up my data, more data to Amazon for a 5% gain in convenience.
Yeah, same for me, I think. I'll stick to using my phone to tap to pay or using my credit card. But I think that given the fact that we already give Apple or your phone manufacturer our biometric data, do we actually do that? Is it stored locally? Or do we actually give them our data?
I mean, we can never really know because in theory it is stored locally, but it could very well be sent over to Google.
We should ideally limit the companies that have our biometric data because it has potential significant implications, especially in the future where governments might be interested as well with these biometric data, whether it's your palm or your fingerprint or even your face. So I think it pays to be cautious when it comes to things like that.
Another issue I have with this is a practical one, which is that if you have to physically press your entire palm down onto something as opposed to just scan it in the air, then you're going to have hundreds of people every day walk by and press their grubby hands onto this one glass surface. I'd rather not do that.
It is a picture, by the way. It's not a whole palm press.
If it's a picture, then how can they ensure that it's actually going to be 100% accurate? Because when it comes to payments, it has to be 100% accurate.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because I'm quite skeptical about this palm signature. Because if you say do some work in the garden or your hand gets injured, then might your palm signature change? So then you would struggle to pay. So I'm very skeptical about this whole picture of your palm thing.
Yeah, and even if they try to use like the blood vessels in your hand, well, if you slightly change the orientation of your hand or squish your hand a little just by accident, then all of a sudden it seems, to me at least, it seems impossible that Amazon can completely reliably identify the person based off just a photo of the hand.
Finally, it has emerged that Nvidia graphics card services are cheaper in China than in the United States. Small cloud providers are charging approximately $6 an hour for a basic rack with 8 Nvidia A100 accelerator cards, whilst they're charging about $10 in the US. However, it should be noted that large cloud providers like Alibaba and ByteDance in China, which can often be more reliable, charge more but are competitive with Western equivalents like Amazon Web Services. So I think this is a big whoops moment, because the whole point of the United States limitation in terms of supply of these Nvidia graphics cards is that Chinese companies should not be able to access these Nvidia graphics cards as easily. But that's clearly not the case, and they seem to be easily procured as well on Chinese e-commerce websites such as Taobao. So does this mean that the United States' effort to limit access to Nvidia graphics card has failed?
Given that these are the latest and best graphics cards from Nvidia, I think this is indeed a big whoops moment for the United States. However, because the United States have only really recently began pushing much harder for export restrictions for Nvidia graphics cards to China, I think we have to wait and see what the next generation of Nvidia graphics cards are like and whether China gets access to those. I also think it's maybe important to consider that energy and living costs and things like that in China are probably much lower than they are in the US, and therefore you'd expect graphics cards to be cheaper because electricity is the main running cost of graphics cards, and if that's lower in China, then it kind of makes sense for the services over there to be a bit cheaper than in the West.
I think the key issue, though, is that the supply chains are so sophisticated that through countries like Singapore, Chinese companies can easily procure these Nvidia graphics card, if at a slight premium. So I think that the US should reconsider their whole strategy in terms of cutting off access to these graphics card to China, because it might not work. And what's worse is that it might encourage Chinese companies like Huawei to make their own graphics card technology. And if it's any good, then it will not only backfire, but mean that the US could be at a disadvantage. I do, however, think that Huawei is quite a long way off from ever challenging Nvidia.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I think all of these trade sanctions, they potentially just increase tensions between the two countries without actually materially stopping China from developing the best large language models that they can. And I think Donald Trump actually, I think he actually wants to reduce the amount of economic sanctions that the US are imposing on China. And I think this is a great example of where he might actually be right.
Another case of these measures not working out is with Russia. Back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Western countries put lots of sanctions on Russia, but it seems that Russia is getting along just fine and their economy is actually doing quite well. And they've also been able to procure everything that they need militarily and for civilian use through countries in Central Asia and China. So I don't think it works very well, these restrictive trade policies.
The world is simply too interconnected for these to ever really work. Now, I want to take a bit of a look at graffiti and some of the history behind it, as well as understanding Banksy a little bit more. A few weeks ago, I went to Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal, and as I was exploring the city as the sun was rising, I saw graffiti absolutely everywhere. Walls of used buildings, walls of abandoned buildings, rows of colourful bins everywhere. But there was also a lot of street art, places that were dedicated for graffiti artists to do their thing. And in fact, my favourite one was this huge wall called the Marvel Art Wall, which was in a courtyard smack bang between multiple skyscrapers in the modern district of the city. So clearly, Lisbon is a city run by artists, one where culture and creativity isn't just valued, but proudly and loudly embraced. Yet, most cities take the opposite approach, hunting down graffiti artists, calling them criminals, and putting them all behind bars. I guess no one likes to wake up to their building being vandalized with graffiti, but is it really that bad?
I think if done well, graffiti can really give a city a unique culture that makes it less industrial and different from all the other cities, and that can be very valuable.
To understand graffiti, we need to go back to a time before civilization even began, 35,000 years ago in the caves of southern France.
Quand le bouvier vient du labour.
Our ancestors were drawing pictures of lions, rhinos, deer, bison, hyenas, the whole lot. And I didn't even know that France had bison and hyenas and all of that. But anyway, these pictures, they were clearly not to functionally communicate with other humans, but they were instead a way to express ideas and emotions and share them with your family. It was a way to enjoy spending your time, your free time, and leaving your mark for the rest of humanity.
The huge amount of painted caves we've discovered yet, all the art they've left us, it shows us that those societies were in good health, because if they did have time to do all of this, it's because they had free time. And it shows they do have a life, they do have culture, they do have art, as we do today. They might have not done it for the very same reason, but they do have it. And it shows that they do not just merely survive, they live.
And this is where it began. An idea which continued in pretty much the same way through the ancient Australian tribes, the Egyptians, the Romans, but then, in the 1960s, graffiti changed forever. The kids of New York, especially the groups who skateboarded everywhere, they lived through a movement known as writing.
Express yourself.
The aim was to have your name written in as many places across the city as possible.
Once you get into it, it's a very addicting thing. It's a very obsessive thing. Especially when it's just like individuals going out there to try to get their name out there as much as they can, as big as they can, as bright as they can. It just ends up being this competitive sport.
Of course, they knew this was illegal, so most writers would instead come up with their own tag to remain anonymous. And you can think of a tag as a kind of signature, but it's not actually your real name. But as you can imagine, just taking a Sharpie and writing your tag on the side of a train or the back of a road sign isn't going to stand out very much. So these kids, they had to get creative. They began experimenting with colours, size, lettering, and coming up with new ways to represent their tag. And through the rest of the 20th century, the craft evolved rapidly. Some artists preferred to make their mark with an icon or a symbol, but most stuck to words and really focused on extracting as much out of the letters as they could. And this is why most graffiti that you see today, especially the illegal works, are centered around a word or a phrase. The idea of getting your name out there from the 1960s is still core to modern graffiti culture. In fact, these artists spend hours just perfecting their tag and figuring out ways of drawing it as fast as possible. And some have even turned their tags into physical merch to help earn a bit of extra cash. All of this just because some 1960s kids thought it'd be cool to have their name all over the place. But if you've ever aimlessly explored a Western city, such as Lisbon or Brussels, or really anywhere in America, you'd notice a lot of large paintings on the sides of buildings. Paintings so big, so good, and so prominent that they can't have been done by some hooded skateboarders at 2 a.m. These are murals, which are typically works paid for by a landlord or even the city council. Now, my favourite mural is the Tintin one in Brussels, where the artist painted some stairs on the side of a building, and they had Tintin Snowy and Captain Haddock running down the stairs, seemingly frightened and away from something. I don't really know what, but I love this mural.
I remember when England lost in the penalties in the final of the Euros, Marcus Rashford's mural in Manchester was heavily vandalised, and there were lots of derogatory phrases and words written on it. So I think these murals can have significant cultural influence.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why I loved this Tintin mural so much, because it shows the world one of the biggest cultural impacts that Brussels has had, which is comic books.
I started to explore mural arts simply because I like being outside and I like connecting to, people. I'm a real sociable dude, so when people come by, I enjoy engaging with them and hearing stories, and especially hearing stories about the community that I'm painting in. So painting murals, brought me fulfillment through the communal aspect, and also through the amount of impact that I could create just from painting a wall.
The late 1900s was a tough time for graffiti artists. The public refused to respect them, and their links to criminal gangs was just one reason for it. But over the past couple of decades, we've seen a rise in appreciation for graffiti artists, enabled, I think, by social media. The internet and rise of Instagram especially has caused a surge in popularity for murals and any sort of artwork done by these once hidden street artists. And I think the visual first nature of Instagram has made street art shine and allowed it the respect which graffiti artists have been desperate for decades.
I think that's because art goes beyond language barriers and anybody can appreciate a piece of good art. And so Instagram has really made it easy for people to discover this art, which previously existed but weren't accessible because previously you would have to go to the physical location of the art, whereas now you can easily see it on Instagram on your phone. And that has been really valuable, I think, for these graffiti artists.
Still, lots of landlords and governments are at war against creators, particularly in high traffic areas where tourists stream through, such as the London Underground or the Brooklyn Bridge. However, I personally reckon that these murals and this art on the side of public buildings, they actually increase the tourist flow through these areas, which is probably a good thing for the country's economy. Also, some artists, they speak out against the flooding of social media posts about graffiti, because they claim that it commodifies their craft and allows a sea of low-quality art to be made and shared. What can't be denied, however, is the positive effect that social media has had on the lives of graffiti artists. They are more in demand than they ever have been before, and after years of struggling to get by, many have become successful street artists by day, whilst remaining hippie graffitists by night. In fact, plenty of artists are being contracted to design shoes, hoodies, and other apparel that are currently popular with Gen Z. But, of course, we can't talk about graffiti without mentioning Banksy.
Who is Banksy?
The elusive street artist.
Banksy is pretty much the Batman of artists.
He's arguably the most famous graffiti artist we've ever seen, as a result of the juxtaposition between the foggy yet crystal clear identity that he's wrapped up in. Because no one really knows who Banksy is, he's just the boy from Bristol. But personally, I reckon law enforcement around the world are very well aware of his real identity, and despite there being multiple active charges against him, I think law enforcement understands the cultural significance of Banksy, and that's the reason they leave him alone. I think, more importantly, law enforcement understand the power that Banksy has. Because the backbone to Banksy's work is rooted in his distaste for authority, government, and establishments. Lots of his works are political, tackling issues such as poverty, surveillance, and the West's external involvement in the wars, particularly in the Middle East.
This is a way in which the younger generation gets their views on politics heard, because I think usually the political scene is dominated by boomers and older people so much that the younger people often don't feel they have a voice. But through something like graffiti, it's really good that the younger generation can feel comfortable in discussing these issues and for them to get a voice in the world about politics.
Yeah, it's a different way of communicating and a way that a whole generation can really understand. And through this, it's how Banksy has garnered huge public support, which is why chasing after him will probably do more harm than good for any government. Banksy is also known to toy with law enforcement too. In 2013, he began a 1-month show, he called it, on the streets of New York, where every day in October, Banksy created some art on a different street of the city, warranting a whole chase from the NYPD, which of course resulted in nothing but more media attention on Banksy. Ironically, people taking Banksy art have faced more legal issues than Banksy himself. And in fact, you may remember that recent stop sign that was stolen from London after Banksy painted some war drones on it in reference to the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Yes, I remember reading the news about that.
Banksy represents the whole hidden world of graffiti artists, and he was actually a pioneer in the field. As the chase against the NYPD heated up, Banksy realised that he needs to spend as little time as possible making his creations. Now, this was of course already well known among graffiti artists, but with all of these police resources being thrown directly at Banksy, he needed a much better way. The solution? Stencils.
I mean, they're efficient. Stencils, you get to put something up in very little time, and it's very hard to mess it up.
And because no one else was using stencils at the time, Banksy's art developed the distinctive style that he's still associated with today, a style that's been the source of inspiration for many up-and-coming artists. Now, as I was researching this story, I came across the term brandalism. Kuankuan, have you ever heard of the term brandalism before?
No, I haven't, but I can't help but think it's to do with brands and vandalism. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. Basically, when people accuse Banksy of vandalizing cities and people's houses and public buildings, Banksy's response to that is that, well, brandalism is a real issue, not vandalism. And he defines brandalism to be exactly what you just said, which is brands that kind of display adverts all over the city, which is very prominent in America, especially across all the skyscrapers. There are huge screens with adverts of all of these companies plastered all over the place. And Banksy claims that the people walking through these streets, they're forced to see these ugly adverts they really don't want to see. And that is the real issue. That is brandalism. And his so-called vandalism is not the issue, or so he claims.
That's a really interesting perspective from Banksy about brandalism. Lots of people are just getting fed up with these corporate advertisements. And so I think Banksy represents a push against such corporate occupation of the public's attention.
It's almost synonymous with that idea that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So while some people think that Banksy is a criminal, to other people he's really just someone who's fighting against all of these big establishments that are exploiting their power against the general population. So it's really difficult to choose a side here, because both sides have perfectly valid arguments.
I think it shows the power that Banksy and graffiti as a movement in general has in changing the public perception on things like laws regarding vandalism and corporate marketing. And it gets people to think about the moral boundaries in between these ideas, irrespective of the law, which might say that what Banksy did is illegal.
Governments don't speak to people our age, but Banksy, he can. From its origins as a primal form of expression scrawled on cave walls to the skateboarders of New York City in the 60s, graffiti has evolved into both a form of rebellion and an artistic portfolio. What started as a game to simply mark a name has become a gateway to global recognition, clients, and even political movements. Social media has been paramount in bringing graffiti to the masses, allowing artists to monetize their work and build followings. But it's also created tension. Does commodifying street art undermine its raw rebellious roots? Or does it give artists the freedom to create without fear of persecution? Either way, one thing is clear. Graffiti, in all its forms, isn't going anywhere. The streets will always be canvases for artists to express, challenge, and make us question the world around us. As Banksy once said, imagine a city where graffiti wasn't illegal. A city where everybody could draw whatever they liked. Where every street was awash with a million colours and little phrases. Where standing at a bus stop was never boring. A city that felt like a party where everyone was invited, not just the estate agents and barons of big business. Imagine a city like that.
A couple of days ago, I went to a supermarket and I was amazed of all the healthy food options that existed, all the way from all sorts of fruit juices, cold-pressed various shots, including, to my disgust, courgette in one of the drinks. But also, there was a huge high-protein range, and they were advertising 35 grams in this milkshake, 25 grams in this yogurt pot, and I just thought that people these days don't need that much protein. They don't need that much food in general, of course, but I think most people have enough of the macronutrients that they need, and what they should really be concerned with is ultra-processed foods and eating the correct amount, which is often less than what they actually eat.
This is akin to the beauty industry, where these big companies, they prey on social pressures and the fact that humans always want to achieve some sort of goal, and these companies claim that their absurdly priced products will help the human achieve the goal. Whereas in reality, the solution to, for example, becoming healthier or having better skin, the solution is much simpler and much easier, whereas humans just want a really, in-your-face way to achieve their goal, and companies prey on this natural human nature, which I do not think is good, and I think more regulation needs to be applied to these companies. A couple of weeks ago, I replaced my phone screen protector from the default one that came free with my device to the Spigen screen protector, and it was incredible So I'm usually really stressed out by screen protector applications because you only have one shot, and you obviously want it to be aligned perfectly without any bubbles. Now, what Speak can do is they provide this sort of plastic bracket that you put on your phone, which aligns your screen protector. And I've used those things before with other companies, but Speakin's one is so good because it's manufactured incredibly precise, which means that it's literally impossible to not get a perfect alignment. And I only had 2 bubbles in my screen protector, which literally took, 20 seconds to squish out. And so I'm delighted with my Speakin screen protector.
I'm still using the factory screen protector that my phone shipped with because I fear that if I try to apply a screen protector, which I already have, it's just that I'm too scared of bubbles and misaligning my screen protector, especially on my curved screen, that I will just refuse to apply it. Unless maybe I go to China and pay somebody to do it for me.
I don't like how you can never really tell whether a screen protector for a slightly curved phone, whether the screen protector is actually curved itself. So my old phone was a OnePlus 7T, and the screen itself wasn't curved, but the front glass panel was. And therefore you still needed a curved screen protector, which I did not buy, and therefore I lived with horrendous bubbles for 3 years. Speaking of horrendous, I want to talk about styluses and pens on devices. For example, the Apple Pencil on the iPads. I think that's a pretty good pencil, and it's quite similar to HP's pencil on their 2-in-1 devices, and I think they're pretty good, but what I don't like is how you're essentially writing using a hard surface on another hard surface, because the tip is hard, and obviously the glass screen is hard. I don't really like that sensation. But you then get pens like the official Surface Pro Pen, which has a rubber tip, and I think that's even worse, because if you're writing maths all day, which I will of course be doing when I join university, then you don't want to have a huge amount of friction every single time you write something. That's just tiresome and it gets pretty annoying pretty quickly. What I think is the best pen is actually the cheapest Surface Pro Pen, which are the ones that are made for education, because they do have a plastic tip, so there is less friction between the screen and your pen, but more importantly, you also get tactile feedback, because the nib is almost like suspended into the pen. So the harder you press, the more the nib is pushed into the pen, and you can feel that as you write. And I think that strikes a perfect balance between the lack of friction whilst remaining tactile and quiet. I think more pens should be like that.
Our thought from the beginning of the episode was, should more people switch to an e-ink or dumb phone?
But there's also been this new wave of devices specifically created to not be as distracting. Some people are calling them dumb phones. Sometimes they're even more limited communication, but the thing they all have in common is they literally can't get caught in a doom scrolling loop because they don't have apps or any distractions on them at all. They're purely for function.
I was actually inspired by a MKBHD video about trying out one of these e-ink phones, and I just thought that there might be quite a significant proportion of the population which could actually benefit from one of these phones, and it might allow them to have a better relationship with their phone and have less doom scrolling on social media, for example.
Yeah, I think these phones, I feel like initially, like my first impressions are that they're really quite stupid because they're going backwards in terms of our technology. We're getting a less functional phone, and I just don't see why. However, I think the general population, most people, especially teenagers, I think they would benefit from a less functional phone because it acts as a way to stop them from doom scrolling endlessly on TikTok or Instagram Reels and Twitter and X and so on. Whilst these phones, they seem kind of silly to me, I think they do have they very much do have practical implications.
I think the crucial thing is people need to be deliberate with their screen time, and if that means scrolling for an hour on TikTok, that's fine if it's a conscious choice. But what often happens is that these social media companies are so good at getting our attention that we scroll for an unintendedly long amount of time, and this phone might address that quite well, and it could be very useful for people who feel like they spend too much time on social media.
I think the problem with this is that, I mean, this phone, it usually targets younger people, right? And younger people aren't about to go ahead and spend another £500 on an e-ink phone. And that means that the only people who are really going to buy this phone are the productivity enthusiasts who really, really, really see value in a less feature-rich phone. So I don't think this concept will ever hit mainstream.
And I think we see with Apple and potentially Google as well, giving us focus modes and things like that to help us manage our time on our devices. So I think it will be a niche forever, but we might see some of the ideas that this represents becoming more mainstream as Apple and Google adopt these features.
This kind of comes back to our Telegram segment from earlier, which is TikTok at fault for people spending so much time on the platform? Because TikTok creates the tool, but it's ultimately the end user that makes a conscious decision to spend hours scrolling through useless videos. So does TikTok have any social responsibility in this regard?
I think you can't make that TikTok's responsibility, because that would be contrary to their business model, which is to serve you ads and to get your attention so that you use the platform more, so that they can serve you more ads. And if you make it TikTok's responsibility, there becomes a huge conflict of interest, which I don't think can ever work under any circumstance.
So how can we solve this issue?
I think we need an increased awareness of this so that parents can help their teenage children with screen time. I think more parents should use certain apps that can monitor the screen time of their children. And for the wider adult population, I think more self-control is needed, but also if there's a resurgence in going out and touching grass, that would be most helpful to the screen time issue. I don't think you can ever rely on social media companies, though, to fix this. And I don't think governments should interfere with people's lives so much that it has an effect on reducing screen time, if that makes sense. So it should be down to the person themselves.
And speaking of touching grass, let's end that there because I want to go touch some grass right now.
Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And remember to follow us on X at the WaffleByte. That's the _WaffleByte. See you there.